All right, hi everyone. I hope you guys are having a great day. So in this video, the plan is to finish the slides on chapter 1. So we're going to be primarily discussing the history of abnormal psychology. So we're going to do a crash course in the way that individuals throughout history have viewed psychological problems. And of course, our understanding of where these psychological problems come from will inevitably impact the way we think we should treat psychological problems as well. And then at the very end, we'll briefly mention a few different perspectives that people have today about where psychological issues might originate. But we will have a lot more information about that when we get to our lecture on Chapter 3. You will see a discussion of Activity 1 in this lecture video. So the topic will be discussed there. Remember that I am looking for your original thoughts. If you use any sources, please be sure to cite those appropriately. Remember that I'm looking for at least 200 words. More is fine, but at least 200. So I encourage you with caution, if you do decide to use sources, make sure that the vast majority of your response is your original work. If you have questions about any of this, please feel free to shoot me an email and let me know. But I'm going to be looking for, did you answer the question? And did you cite appropriately if you used any citations? And also, I'm going to be looking to see if you have those 200 words. So if you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get into lecture.
All right, so today's lecture video is going to finish chapter 1 that we started in the first lecture video. And so the majority of today's lecture is going to be focusing on the historical perspectives on abnormal psychology, but we will kind of finish up with some different current modern theoretical orientations as well. So starting off with a little bit of information here about the prevalence rates of different psychological issues. So we have some statistics here. In any given year, as many as 30% of adults and 19% of children and adolescents in our country display serious psychological disturbances and are in need of clinical treatment. Now, I want to say a few things about this. So whenever you're doing this kind of research, there are several different things that make this complicated. One is that people may be misdiagnosed, and so someone may be suffering from a psychological condition, but maybe perhaps for different reasons we'll talk about later in the semester could have maybe been treated for a medical condition, but it could really be more psychological. Also, sometimes people who have psychological problems don't admit that they have psychological problems or seek treatment. We actually see that the majority of people experience symptoms for even years at a time with certain disorders before they do seek treatment. So these numbers may actually be a little bit lower than the true number. And of course, not everyone who meets diagnosis is receiving appropriate care as well. But in addition to these numbers, also there are some people who do not meet criteria for a disorder but are experiencing some distress, are experiencing some dysfunction, and could benefit from counseling. My personal perspective is that everyone could benefit from counseling. So we have this question, are things getting worse? Psychologically, as a country, is our mental health getting worse? Well, on the one hand, I would say that we certainly are living in a society that's different from society in the past. For example, technology has created all kinds of wonderful new ways to get information and to communicate with each other, but it has also presented a lot of new ways to bully people and mistreat people, and new ways to access information that creates anxiety and competition and all kinds of things. So the question is, are we making our psychological problems worse? Because our society is very individualistic, very competitive, and also fairly hooked on smartphones and technology. Well, what we see is that every society has had psychological issues. So, is it possible that certain psychological conditions wax and wane over time? It's possible. But we're not going to look back and say, oh, those were the good old days when no one was ever having any anxiety or mood problems or any substance use or anything like that. It's always been around. And that's really what we're going to talk about for the majority of lecture today. The idea that the treatments that we had in the very beginning, we learned from. So what I want to say is that we have come a long way. But clinical psychology, compared to some other fields, is a very young field. Compared to biology and astronomy, we have not been at this as long as many other fields have. And also, because of some of the things that have happened in the history of clinical psychology, people do not always trust psychologists. I will say, I can't go get my hair cut without someone asking me, oh, so what do you do for a living? And when I tell them that I teach for psychology departments, they always say, don't psychoanalyze me. To which my answer is, I don't do that for free, so don't worry. You'll know if I psychoanalyze you because you'll get a bill. That's a joke, but no, seriously, a lot of people don't trust psychologists, and from a certain perspective, we have to kind of understand there are some dark things in our history. So present-day ideas and treatments have roots in their past, but we have come a long way. This unfortunate individual, we believe, to have been the victim of a process called trephination, which we're going to be talking about in a second, which is a whole lot of no fun, I can imagine. All right. Ancient views. Let's go way back in time. So we know that psychological problems have existed as long as people have existed. This has been part of our society. But ancient societies, we seem to have some evidence that they believed that abnormal behavior was caused by possession of evil spirits, demons, that kind of thing. And so, without the benefit of the research and the technology and the things that we have today, people may have assumed that odd behavior that was maybe deviant from the culture, was caused by things like demons. So, individuals then, because of their viewpoint, this is what I want you to see throughout today's lecture, where you view the origin of psychological problems, that impacts your idea of treatment. So if you believe that psychological problems originate with evil spirits, then your treatment will focus on evil spirits. So they did a couple of things here. Trephination, which is what I was referring to on this other slide, basically involved drilling holes in the skull while the individual was alive. I'm sure that there were some individuals who did not survive this treatment, and I'm sure, I use treatment loosely, and I'm sure there were individuals who probably had this treatment forced upon them that did not volunteer for this treatment, but the idea was to drill a hole in the skull, possibly multiple holes, to try to allow evil spirits to escape. Exorcism, also, maybe something you're a little bit more familiar with, some kind of religious ceremony process that probably involved the religious leader trying to get the evil spirits to leave a person. Now, this is something that is not a commonly held view today, but during this particular time period, it was the prevalent view. So, as people tried to understand where psychological problems come from, and maybe tried to understand how we could better treat them, there were many different ideas. And so during this time period, and the slide talks about 500 BC to 500 AD, which is a period of about 1,000 years. So remember, the way time works is that the years progressively get closer to 1 when you're doing BC. So it would be 501 BC, 500 BC, 499 BC, and so on, all the way up to 1 BC, and then we would go from 1 BC to 1 AD. So there's actually no year 0. So it goes from 1 BC to 1 AD, and so then another 500 years AD. So we're talking about, during this time period, several different explanations. Philosophers and early physicians had different thoughts on where disorders come from and how to treat them. Hippocrates in particular had an idea here that was considered, it was very, the word I'm looking for, kind of radical and interesting during its time period, and may still have some level of influence today. We're going to talk later during this lecture about how we debate whether psychological problems are more caused by physical problems or are they more caused by psychological problems. So we'll get there in a second. But Hippocrates suggested a biological cause for psychological problems, basically an unbalance in your humors. So Hippocrates believed that there were four fluids in the body: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, which is as pleasant as it sounds. So then perhaps one might think that if you have an excess of one fluid or not enough of another fluid, then that could create some psychological problems. So maybe this person has an excess of blood, and so they have anger issues because of that kind of thing. Or maybe I would imagine black bile is probably associated with depression. This person is sad, that kind of thing. So the treatments there would be to try to bring those humors or those fluids back into balance. One way, for example, they did this was bloodletting. So the idea that you could use maybe leeches or knives or any other number of ideas of ways to maybe let some blood out to try to reduce psychological problems. Probably not super effective, but some early ideas about where psychological problems might have come from. And then as we move into the Middle Ages, this is a time period when religion was very, very prominent. When it talks about the church here, we're talking predominantly about the Catholic Church, which was kind of in control of education, in control of kind of social norms and what was considered okay and not okay. So we kind of went from originally believing in the evil spirits causing the problems to then maybe it's more of a biological problem. Maybe we have too much blood or not enough bile or something like that. And then during the Middle Ages, we kind of went back to that demonology idea. And as the church kind of was impacting the way people were thinking about psychological problems, people started thinking again, maybe these are evil forces, maybe this has to do with demons, demon possession. And so things like exorcism might have returned a little bit more. Now, at the close of the Middle Ages, though, this starts to decline, and people start looking for new explanations of where psychological problems come from. So what I hope you're seeing a trend here is that what society in general believes about psychological problems impacts the way we treat psychological problems. And that's not something that's unique to the ancient times or to the Middle Ages. It happens today. The way society views something dictates whether we view it as a psychological disorder or not, and how we treat it. So continue to keep that in mind. So kind of moving ahead a little bit during a Renaissance time here, we're kind of blowing through history very quickly. During this time period, demonology was getting less popular. People were starting to wonder, maybe it has something to do with the environment. Maybe it has something to do with the way we're caring for people. I mean, have you tracked with me so far? We had people who have psychological problems, so we drilled holes in their heads, or we performed exorcisms, or we did bloodletting. I mean, there's maybe the way we're treating these psychological problems is not helping. Maybe it's even making it worse. And maybe, perhaps, the mind is just a part of the body, and it can become ill just like any other part of the body. And so maybe we need to start treating this differently. Maybe we need to stop punishing people for having psychological issues. So this is going to be a good time, generally speaking, compared to trephination. This is a good time for the field of psychology. So what are we going to do if we start to wonder if it has to do with the environment, with how we're treating people, and if we wonder if it has to do with just an illness of the mind? Then perhaps the thing to do would be to focus on humane and loving treatments. So there was a religious movement here, as well as kind of a society at whole, a movement towards asylums, which today the term asylum has a negative connotation to it. But at the time, an asylum was just basically an institution that was supposed to take care of people who were mentally ill. The idea is that if we can bring people who need help together and connect them with people. So think about our definitions here. We have sufferers and we have healers, and they're working together, and we're providing a caring, nurturing environment. Then surely that will help. Surely people will get better. Now, this was a good intention. However, what happens is that we have a large number of people who have psychological problems, and so our asylums become overcrowded. And when something becomes overcrowded, then the individual one-on-one care is going to decrease. So We are wanting to make the situation better, but sometimes in our attempts to make things better, we actually make it worse. And if we bring in people and crowd them together into, what essentially becomes a prison, and as you can imagine, people weren't receiving the best care there. And asylum has obviously become a more like a negative association there. So obviously something went wrong. We have this goal for moral treatment, right? And when you hear about moral treatment, Pinnell is a name that comes up frequently, and others, that we're going to try to say, okay, if we can bring in these people and remember they're people, not treat them like they're animals, not treat them like they're, demon possessed, but if we could treat them with, humanity, like just treat these people with respect. And also, in addition to respect, let's give them clean clothes to wear and, good food to eat and some fresh air. And surely that will be helpful. Well, obviously this is good. This is a good approach. Moral treatment is fantastic. The problem is that there's only so much that moral treatment can do. So if you have someone who's suffering from a major psychological problem, and you take them and you give them respect and you give them clean clothes and you give them food to eat and you take good care of them, that will lessen their symptoms to a degree, but the problem that was already there is likely to linger. And so although the moral treatment was a fantastic improvement, it was only half of the solution. And as you can imagine, some problems came up when we start trying to take care of individuals who have psychological issues, money and staff shortages. So here's what's happening. Because we're not really solving the underlying problem, no one ever leaves. So someone who has a psychological problem comes in, they're getting help, they're getting care, that's fantastic, but they're not getting cured or healed or even having improvements to the point where they can function on their own. And so once you bring in people and you help them to a certain extent, but you don't help them all the way, people will come and stay. So money and staff shortages, people were not actually recovering completely. So then there's too many people there, and it talks about the emergence of prejudice here. Prejudice is basically an attitude that you have towards someone because of group membership. So we have always had a prejudice against individuals who have psychological issues. And so now by bringing these people together and having them live together, it creates an opportunity for people to be labeled, right? So moral movement, it was a good partial solution. It just wasn't enough. And basically what's happening is we're keeping people in hospitals for the majority of their lives because they're not able to function outside of the hospital. So it became clear that the moral movement was, well intended, but was not enough. So we need a better solution. So two different solutions emerged at this point, and we really don't have a solid answer to this day about which one of these is the better perspective. Actually, this is going to be where your first activity asks you to weigh in about your views on this perspective, but we'll get there in a second. So we're going to talk about the somatogenic perspective, which when you hear somato, that's going to be referring to the body. Basically, we're saying there are physical causes for abnormal functioning. And then the psychogenic perspective is going to suggest that we have psychological causes to our abnormal functioning. Of course, it's not always one or the other. It's sometimes a combination of both. Now, if we start off talking about the somatogenic perspective, the idea that your behavioral issues and dysfunction and distress are caused by physical problems, we had this idea early on. If we're thinking back to Hippocrates and his humors, that was a very primitive early version of this perspective. But it kind of started making a comeback. For one thing, Kraepelin and others started looking at the connection between physical factors and mental dysfunction. So imagine a person who's having long-term sleep issues. Can you imagine how long-term sleep issues could then potentially be caused by a physical issue, but then could cause depression, could cause anxiety, could cause attention problems, any number of other things. If a person is in pain, for example, maybe their pain is caused by a physical issue, but a person who is in pain is also prone to have some psychological issues as well. But in addition to that, we made some exciting research discoveries during this time period, which had to do with, of all things, syphilis. Syphilis being a sexually transmitted disease that is easily treated and curable with penicillin. At this point in time, we figured out that we could cure syphilis with penicillin. Yay! But the reason this is connected to abnormal psychology is that if syphilis is left untreated for a long period of time, it can start to produce psychological symptoms, things like dementia and others. So we start to wonder, okay, this person started having psychological problems because this person had syphilis and wasn't treated. I wonder if there are other things we haven't recognized yet. So people who have psychological disorders, what if they really have a medical disorder and we haven't identified that yet or haven't figured out how to treat it? So there was a lot of excitement going into the somatogenic perspective. However, when we started looking for psychological problems that were kind of predated by physical problems, we didn't find a whole lot of things. For a long period of time here, the research wasn't really supporting this somatogenic perspective until we discovered medications. And that's when we found that we can do things like, for example, and we'll talk more about this later, but we can do things like impact neurotransmitters with medication and then decrease depression or decrease anxiety. And so the somatogenic perspective has come back into vogue once we've discovered these medications. All right? On the other hand, we can have a psychogenic perspective. The psychogenic perspective has to do with the idea that your psychological issues are causing your abnormal functioning. So it's not a biological problem, a physical problem, it's a psychological problem. Now, this became popular because of the work primarily of Sigmund Freud. So when I ask people, who do you think of when you think of psychology, usually people say Freud. That's one of the first things people say. And I get that. I understand that. Freud should be given a lot of credit for really drawing attention towards psychology. He wrote quite a bit. He contributed to the field. What I will say, though, is that a lot of Freud's work was really hard to verify, really hard to do research on. You'll get a flavor for this as we kind of go through and talk about different theoretical orientations later. But Freud kind of got things started a little bit. So he and the Neo-Freudians, or the people who came after him, offered treatment primarily to people who had kind of less severe issues, and this is more what we would call outpatient therapy. So maybe not going into the asylums and working with people who were like receiving long-term hospitalization, but maybe working with people who were having issues on an outpatient basis. Although Freud's therapy did tend to last for long periods of time, maybe go on for years. Now, psychoanalytic theory or psychodynamic theory are two different terms you'll hear associated with Freud. So Freud's theory could be called psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, basically saying that all the issues that we're having are psychological in nature. We'll go into much more detail about this coming up. But people were excited about Freud's theories, and people still get excited about Freud's theories to a certain extent. All right. Your first activity, refer back to the introduction to talk about the due dates and times of all that with the first activity. Activity 1 asks you to discuss your thoughts on the somatogenic versus psychogenic issues. So what I'm asking you to do is to decide, do you believe that distress and dysfunction are caused by biological causes? That would be somatogenic. Is it something to do with our hormones, something to do with our neurotransmitters, something that we inherit from our parents perhaps, something biological? Or do you believe that abnormal functioning, distress, dysfunction are caused by psychological problems? Do you think that maybe it's more of anxiety and depression and those kinds of things that cause our problems? So I'm asking you to think about whether the issues we have are more physical or more psychological. And I'm also going to ask you to think about why it matters, why your opinion matters. Throughout this lecture and continuing on with this lecture, we're talking about the fact that your understanding of what causes a psychological problem will directly impact the treatment that you choose for that psychological problem. So I want you to be thinking about how our thoughts on the origin of problems impact the way we treat problems. All right? So let me know if you have any questions. Remember, your activities need to be at least 200 words long. Okay, great. So, as I said, we have these two different perspectives. We have the somatogenic biological perspective. We have the psychogenic psychological perspective. The somatogenic perspective kind of stalled out for a while there because we didn't find what we were looking for in the research until we discovered psychotropic medications. So these are medications that impact your psychological functioning, your cognitive functioning in some way. Now, this really blew up in the 1950s and since then. So during this time period, we have developed several different types of drugs. Most of the psychotropic drugs fall into one of these three categories. So we have antipsychotic drugs that are going to be used to treat psychotic symptoms, which we'll have a lecture later, but this is basically schizophrenia and schizophrenia-related disorders. Antidepressant drugs and mood stabilizers, things for people who have mood disorders, and then anti-anxiety drugs, so treating anxiety disorders. Now, these early medications had some really nasty side effects for the most part. The medications that we produce today still do have some side effects, but they're nowhere as severe as the side effects that we were finding in the early medications. Having said that, though, this led to some deinstitutionalization. In other words, people who had never been able to function outside of an institution, once they receive these medications, might have enough of a reduction in their symptoms to be able to go out and live outside of the institution. So this led to more outpatient care, people combining medication with also maybe some other medical or other psychological treatments as well, and kind of reducing the strain on asylums and other institutions, which is great. Since the 1950s, outpatient care has been the most common choice. So people today who have psychological problems oftentimes do have like an outpatient situation. So sometimes, depending on the severity, you might actually meet with your clinician once a week, twice a week, maybe more. Sometimes people meet maybe once a month, maybe for a group therapy session or just kind of a relapse prevention where we've already done therapy, but now we're just going back in to check and make sure everything's still going well, that kind of thing. There are other options. Inpatient therapy does still exist. There are some treatments that are specialized depending on the disorder. So, for example, if a person is having substance issues, then it might be good for them to go through the early parts of their treatment in a medical facility where that can be, their withdrawal symptoms can be managed with medication to try to prevent some of the nasty side effects people have when they're coming off of illicit substances. So the treatment is going to depend on the diagnosis. It's going to depend on how much money someone has and what your insurance is willing to cover. But outpatient is probably the most common way to receive treatment. All right. In addition to trying to treat the problems that have already come up, we would like to prevent problems if at all possible. So the community mental health approach has given rise to this prevention movement, the idea that maybe there are some social conditions that are causing psychological problems. And you're going to see some correlations here. We'll talk about what correlation means coming up. But you're going to see some associations with poverty and psychological problems. Maybe unemployment and psychological problems. Maybe divorce or unhealthy marriage relationships and psychological problems. So if we could perhaps, using research, identify some social conditions that increase risk, if we could try to reduce those, or at least we can identify people who are at risk because they are in those conditions, then maybe we can get them help earlier rather than later. Maybe we can try to reduce the harm here, which leads to the idea of positive psychology. So psychology is often thought of in kind of negative terms of you're studying people who have psychological problems, which my answer is pretty much everyone has some form of psychological problems. But what if we could focus on the things that help people function better? Positive psychology is going to say, let's don't look at what's going wrong. Let's look at what's going right. And then we can use that and try to spread that and try to encourage that and reinforce that. So it's going to focus on individuals who are coping well. It's going to focus on resilience and things like that that can help us understand how to help people who are having psychological problems, but really just improve everyone's mental health overall. All right, last couple things today. the theories that we have today, there are many, many different theories on where psychological problems come from and how they should be treated. These are just a few of the most popular ones. So psychoanalytic is going to be traced back to Freud. We're going to have some lectures that will kind of describe this, but the general idea here is that you have different layers of your personality, some that you're aware of, some that you're not aware of, that can have conflict, and that these conflicts can be caused by early childhood experiences. A biological perspective is going to be more of that somatogenic. You're having problems because of neurotransmitter issues, hormone issues, health issues. And so then if you have a biological perspective, you're going to have more of a view towards medications and more medical treatments. Behavioral, which I personally myself trend more towards behavioral. I mean, cognitive behavioral, but maybe a little bit more towards behavioral, is the idea that a person might have psychological problems because unhealthy behaviors were reinforced, or maybe the healthy behaviors were just never reinforced. Maybe they were punished for healthy behaviors. And so then we're going to try to set up a system where positive, healthy behaviors are reinforced, negative, unhealthy behaviors are punished or reduced. Cognitive perspective has to do with not what you're doing, but the way you're seeing the world. So your thought processes, your perspectives, your attitudes. So then if your psychological problem comes from unrealistic thought patterns, then we're going to try to identify those and replace those with more realistic, functional, helpful thought patterns. Humanistic perspective is the idea generally that humans have a great capability for being good and mentally well, but that something happens that disrupts your potential. And so we would have to try to figure out what it is that's blocking a person from achieving their best self. And then sociocultural is going to focus on the, obviously the society and the culture that a person's raised in. Are there maybe some things like poverty? Are there things like prejudice? Are there things like negative social interactions, peer influences, parenting influences that could potentially be causing psychological problems? So, as we go throughout the semester, we'll talk about the research. Some disorders seem to be more behavioral. Some disorders seem to be more cognitive. We're going to talk about the way that our treatments kind of fall in those categories as well. One last thing to say for today's lecture video is that research has been growing substantially in clinical psychology, and this is huge. So when you go into clinical psychology, you can teach. Obviously, you can teach. You can do therapy, you can actually work with clients, but you can also do research where you're working on trying to understand where problems come from and how those can be treated. So this class is not a research class. This class is clinical. I'm going to be focusing more on diagnosis and treatment. However, everything we know about diagnosis and treatment, we know because of research. So during the next lecture video, we're going to have a crash course in research methods terms, so that throughout the semester, when I use these terms about how this study was designed or how this treatment came to be, so that you'll understand me, we need to all start off on a basic level of understanding about research. So clinical researchers try to explain and predict abnormal behavior. Prediction is important. If we can try to identify risk factors, maybe there's something we can do to prevent problems from happening at all, or at the very least try to reduce those problems if possible. We also need to know which treatments are effective, because at the very least, if you're doing a treatment that's not effective, you're not helping your client. But at most, you could be harming your client. It could be that a client goes into therapy with hope, and then you use a treatment that's not effective, and then they lose hope and they think, okay, well, I tried treatment failed me, and so they give up. So using a treatment that doesn't work is, at the very minimum, not helpful and potentially harmful to our clients. So research is the only way we're going to know whether we're doing that. And also thinking about, what does it mean for our therapy to be successful? What does it mean for a person to recover from a particular disorder? All right, lots of information in a short period of time today. So as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Don't forget about Activity 1 and be looking for our next lecture video. Talk to you guys later.